say that even though Israel and Russia renewed, or at the time the Soviet Union, renewed their diplomatic relations in 1991, shortly before the collapse of the Soviet Union, by the way, as I explained in my book. And then, of course, the relations continued with Russia and the other republics of the former Soviet Union. After those relations had been severed by the Soviet Union in 1967, despite the renewal of diplomatic relations, the bottom line is that Israel and Russia have conflicting interests in the Middle East. Russia was probably the worst enemy of Israel during the Cold War. It armed and supported our enemies, not only militarily, but also supported them at the UN. It's the Soviet Union that initiated the 1975 resolution on Zionism, racism. And the fact that we renewed our diplomatic relations in 1991 doesn't mean that those conflicting interests went away, especially when Vladimir Putin decided to implement his, I would call, revengeful foreign policy. Rebuilding relations with the Middle East allies of the Soviet Union, selling nuclear technology to Iran, because don't forget that Iran owes a lot of its nuclear technology to Russia, supporting the Shia-led axis in the Middle East, which includes, of course, Iran, but also the Assad regime or whatever is left of it in Syria and Hezbollah. At the same time, however, Putin, on a personal level, happens to have I would say, a positive attitude towards Israel and the Jews, which is very unusual for a Russian leader. There are many reasons for this, some of them related to his personal history. He respects Israel. He knows that Israel is the biggest military power of the Middle East, and that things need to be coordinated with Israel when it comes to Syria. And therefore, despite conflicting interests with Russia, Israel values its relation with Putin, which is also why, by the way, Israel kept quiet, if you remember, when Putin annexed Crimea in 2014. At the same time, Israel is an ally of the United States. And of course, our alliance with the US comes before anything else. So this leaves Israel in a kind of uncomfortable situation when it comes to the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, because of course, Israel is on the side of the United States, on the respect of borders and of the US-led international order. On the other hand, Israel is wary not to cross Vladimir Putin. But I think that at the end of the day, we'll talk about it, I'm sure, again, during this presentation. I think that at the end of the day, this is something, it's really about Putin trying to obtain concessions from the United States. And Israel is not really a factor, I would say, in his calculations vis-a-vis the US and vis-a-vis NATO.
Right. You just read a